In the late summer of 1874, in a narrow river valley of Montana Territory where spruce crowded the slopes and the water ran black cold even in August, the question wasn't whether winter would come, it was what it would take when it did. A French-Canadian trapper named Étienne Beaulieu had come west on the old fur-lined years of wet camps, lean rations, and long miles until he reached a place he meant to stop running from. He filed his claim because the frontier was changing. Under the Homestead Act, a man could earn land by living on it and improving it, by building something that would still stand when the trails closed and the snow sealed the world shut. The neighbors, Germans with careful joints, Scandinavians who understood winter like a language, and American-born settlers who'd already buried a few mistakes in frozen ground believed in one kind of shelter above all others. A log cabin built fast, notched tight, and chinked until no wind could find its way inside. On the frontier, chinking and daubing wasn't decoration. It was a line of defense, stuffing the horizontal joints between logs with whatever could be found, then sealing it with a wet finish coat so driving wind and snow couldn't turn a home into an icebox. Period practice often relied on a layered logic, rigid blocking like stones or wood, then softer packing like moss or clay, finished with a wet outer coat to seal the wall. So that was the valley's conventional wisdom. If the walls were thick and the chinking held, the fire could do the rest. In a place like this, men measured comfort the way they measured ammunition, by how long it lasted when the world turned hostile. Yet Étienne didn't begin by cutting the straightest logs. He began with the mud, not the casual handfuls a man slapped between timbers at the end of a build, and not the thin daub that cracked away every spring. Étienne hauled river clay in heavy tubs and slat-sided boxes, piling it under canvas like it was flour or shot. He mixed it with chopped grass and fibrous binders, kneading and treading it until it became a dense, sticky mass that clung to his hands like dough. The neighbors watched, confused, because this wasn't chinking. This was something else. They all knew what winter could do here. Men spoke of drifts that swallowed fences and storms that buried doors. They warned about hollows where wind-packed snow could rise and walls where, in the worst seasons, the depth was measured not in inches, but in the height of a man. And in that valley there was one boastful phrase men used when they wanted to sound like they'd seen the real thing: 20-foot snow. Not a level blanket, but the kind of drift that climbs and hardens and turns a cabin into a dugout unless the builder has planned for it. Talk began the way it always did on a frontier. Light at first, carried on breath and laughter. "He's building a cabin out of mud," one man said, not unkindly. Another replied, "A man can't insulate the winter with riverbank slop." A woman paused with a water pail and shook her head. "Chinking's meant for gaps," she said. "Not for whatever that is." Étienne heard them. He did not argue. He kept hauling, kept mixing, kept working the strange, heavy paste until it looked less like ordinary daub and more like a deliberate recipe, measured, reinforced, prepared for a purpose no one else could name. What none of them understood, what they couldn't yet see, was that Étienne wasn't preparing to keep wind out the usual way. He was preparing a kind of insulation the valley didn't recognize, using the oldest material on earth in a way that felt almost secret. But first, everyone laughed. When September cooled the afternoons and the geese began to stitch the sky with migrating lines, Étienne finally began raising his walls. He worked with the tools of the period and the patience of a man who'd survived by getting small things right. The felling axe bit into the pine. The crosscut sang when a neighbor helped. He scored logs with quick chops, then hewed them with a broad axe, letting chips fly in hard, bright flashes. Where another man might leave a log round and accept the drafts as a tax of frontier life, Étienne flattened faces so wood could meet wood with fewer gaps. The neighbors recognized competence. Whatever foolishness the mud suggested, the timber work looked sound. A cabin rose in the expected shape, a single pen, rectangular, 14 feet by 18, modest but serviceable, the corners locked tight. The sill logs sat on stone piers so damp ground wouldn't rot them quickly. It was the kind of detail a man learned only after seeing what moisture could do. Then the valley saw the first sign that the cabin they thought they understood was only the outer shell of something stranger. Étienne began a second wall, not a lean-to, not an addition, a full second log wall running parallel to the first, leaving a measured gap between the two. A German settler named Karl Weiss, a careful man with a careful mind, walked over and stared at the growing double line of timber. "That's wasted work," Karl said at last. "2 cabins where one would do." Étienne set down his adze like a man setting down a verdict. "Not 2, he said. 1. Karl squinted at the space between walls. "Then what's the gap for?" "For stillness," Étienne answered. Karl gave a short laugh. "Stillness doesn't keep a man warm." Étienne only nodded, as if Karl had named a truth that didn't threaten him. What neighbors didn't realize was that Étienne was building as if air mattered more than timber. Most men on that frontier treated air as an enemy only when it moved. They called it draft and they fought it with chinking and extra wood. But Étienne treated moving air like a thief with clever hands able to steal warmth through cracks so small a man could barely see them. Frontier log building practice already understood that chinking and daubing existed to seal a log pen against driving wind and snow, and that the system often involved rigid blocking plus softer packing, then a finish coat. But Étienne wasn't satisfied with filling the gaps between logs. He was shaping the entire boundary so wind had nowhere to work. Still, the neighbors' skepticism grew sharper, because on a homestead there were only so many hours a man could spend perfecting. Winter didn't care about pride. Winter only cared whether there was enough wood, enough food, enough shelter. Each extra log in that second wall meant more felling. Each extra day building meant fewer days cutting firewood. In this country, firewood was a calendar. A man could look at his stack and know whether he was safe. And then the mud appeared again. Étienne drove slim split sticks, barreled slats, and rough laths across the gap, fastening them horizontally, one above another. It looked like the ribs of a basket. He wove short pieces into place so the lattice would hold something heavy. A Scandinavian settler named Olaf Johansson watched without laughing. Olaf had grown up where snow piled against barns and the dark lasted long enough to teach patience. He leaned closer, studying the wooden slats. "He's making shelves," Olaf murmured, "for mud." Someone standing behind Olaf snorted. "Mud shelves, that'll be the day." Then Étienne began mixing again, this time not for chinking, but for filling. He hauled clay to a shallow pit and poured water until the surface shone. He added chopped grass, straw scrounged from threshing, and tufts of coarse animal hair saved from hides. Then he stepped in and began to tread the mixture underfoot, folding it until it became a dense composite that stuck together instead of crumbling. There were old North American French building traditions, especially in French-derived regions farther south and east, where a clay mixture with vegetal binder could be built up into thick insulating wall material around wood framing. Accounts describe mixtures of clay with binders like straw, moss, or animal hair, sometimes with lime added, applied by hand and built substantial enough to form walls. But this was Montana territory, not the humid country of the lower riverlands. Here the air was drier, the frost came early, and clay could freeze before it cured. That was the first real problem. By the 3rd week of September, a north wind arrived with teeth. Morning frost silvered the grass. The top skin of the mixing pit stiffened like congealed fat. If the clay froze before it set properly, it could crack away from the wood and slump inside the wall cavity. The neighbors, watching from the edge of his clearing, began to exchange glances that said the same thing. Winter would settle this argument for them. Little did they know that the early frost forced Étienne into longer hours. He packed the mixture between the walls in heavy handfuls, pressing it hard into the lattice so it gripped the wood like a clenched fist. He worked in sections one bay at a time, packing, smoothing, then moving upward. Karl Weiss came again, drawn by that builder's itch that can't resist a strange method. Karl tapped the outer log, then the packed mud section. "That'll hold water," he said. "Then it'll hold ice." Étienne answered without looking up. "Only if it stays wet." Karl pointed to the shaded side. "And will it dry?" For the first time, Étienne hesitated. Not because he doubted the idea, but because he recognized the risk. Moisture trapped in a wall could become the enemy in a freeze-thaw country. However, he didn't stop. He adjusted. He extended the eaves so rain and meltwater would shed farther from the walls. He worked the roof framing with extra care, building overhang where other cabins had little. Moisture control wasn't a luxury, it was preservation. Even guidance on historic log buildings emphasizes how critical it is to manage moisture through roofs, drainage, and protecting vulnerable parts because moisture accelerates deterioration and failure. Yet the valley still didn't know what the magic mud was supposed to do. People understood chinking. They understood a mud and moss fill between logs. They even understood thick earthen walls in some places. But a double wall with heavy earthen infill felt like an experiment no one had asked for. And that mystery deepened when Étienne began working on his chimney. Most cabins relied on an open hearth or a small iron stove if a man could afford it. Many chimneys were simple stone stacks, sometimes placed outside walls in milder climates, sometimes inside to keep more heat in the living space. Log building tradition recognized those differences and how climate shaped chimney placement. But Étienne wasn't building a casual fireplace. He was building something thick, central, and heavy stone and clay laid like he meant it to hold more than smoke. The neighbors didn't have the language for what they were seeing. They only knew it looked like too much work for a man racing the first snow. And so the valley waited. The real secret would only become clear later. But there was a problem Étienne hadn't anticipated, one that would come not in September and not in October, but when the snow rose high enough to turn a cabin door into a memory. By late October, the color drained from the valley. The grass flattened, the river edges stiffened with thin ice. The first real snow arrived not as a gentle fall, but as a dry, stinging whisper flakes that moved sideways before they ever touched the ground. And now, for the first time, the shape of Étienne's plan began to reveal itself. Not as superstition, but as practical physics. Most cabins lose warmth in ways frontier people described without formal terms. Heat slips outward through the solid walls. Heat escapes when wind finds cracks and replaces warmed interior air with cold. And even when a room's air warms, cold interior wall surfaces can still make that warmth feel thin and temporary. Étienne's magic mud didn't merely fill gaps, it changed how the entire cabin handled heat. The first key was air control. Frontier chinking and daubing systems existed to seal log joints against driving wind and snow, using combinations of rigid blocking and softer packing, finished with a wet outer layer. But the weakness of a typical single-wall log cabin wasn't only the joints, it was that the whole wall system could breathe in the wrong way when the wind pushed hard enough. Étienne built 2 log skins with a cavity between them, then packed that cavity densely enough that air could not move through it. He treated still air as insulation and moving air as theft. He didn't need the term convection to know that moving air carried away warmth, and by sealing the wall core, he reduced the main enemy of winter cabins, air infiltration. The second key was the wall's composite structure. Instead of a thin smear of mud between logs, Étienne created a thick earthen layer reinforced with fiber. In French-derived building traditions, a mixture of clay and vegetal binder straw, moss, animal hair could be formed and applied by hand to create substantial insulating wall material around a wooden frame. That reinforcement mattered because fiber stops cracking from turning into failure. Clay alone can shrink and split. Clay tied with straw and hair behaves differently. It holds together like a rope holds a bundle. But the most important effect was not strength. It was thermal behavior. This is where Étienne's earlier statement, "heavy is the point," becomes the heart of the method. Dense earth has thermal mass. It can absorb heat, store it, and release it slowly. A light wall heats quickly but cools quickly. A heavy wall heats slowly but stays warm longer. On the frontier, a typical cabin lived in violent cycles. The fire flared, the room warmed, the fire died, the room fell cold. The family woke and fed the stove again. All winter was a series of swings. Étienne's wall system smoothed those swings. Heat from the fire didn't only warm the air, it soaked into the mass of the earthen core and the central masonry. Later, when the fire quieted, that stored heat returned gradually. The neighbors had believed warmth was a product of constant flame. Étienne built warmth as a product of storage. That's why the mud had to be heavy. The weight was not wasted, it was capacity. The third key was how Étienne handled the heat source itself. Many settlers relied on an open hearth, and historical descriptions from earlier French colonial North America noted that hearth heat could be intense near the flame but fall off quickly as soon as a person stepped away. Stoves became popular over time partly because they could hold and distribute heat more effectively. Étienne built a stone and clay heat body near the center of the cabin, not merely a simple fireplace. He created a compact firebox and a thicker masonry mass around its stone laid with clay mortar, and shaped so heat could soak into the structure. Descriptions of masonry heaters emphasize that the defining feature is their ability to store a large amount of heat in the masonry thermal mass, then release it slowly, often for 18 to 24 hours, largely through radiant heat. Étienne wasn't using modern names, but he was applying the principle: burn hotter and cleaner for a shorter period, store the heat in mass, and let the cabin radiate warmth steadily rather than spike and collapse. That mattered because on a homestead, wood supply is not infinite. Efficient burning and slow release can be the difference between safety and desperation. The danger Étienne hadn't fully anticipated was now returning to haunt the homestead, and it had sharper teeth than any frost he had faced before. It wasn't only about whether the clay would dry before freezing. It was about what would happen when snow drifted so high that the cabin became half buried. Most settlers feared deep drifts because they meant trapped doors, blocked chimneys, and suffocation. They meant being sealed into a cold box with dwindling wood. They meant panic. But deep snow also does something else. It reduces wind exposure and can create a still, insulating boundary outside walls, so long as moisture is managed and meltwater doesn't soak into the structure. The same frontier people who feared being banked in also sometimes banked snow intentionally around barns to cut wind. They knew the effect. They simply didn't trust it with a home. Étienne, however, had built walls that could tolerate being surrounded walls, where air infiltration was already strangled and where the inner surface was sealed. If snow piled against the exterior logs, the cabin didn't leak heat the same way. The drift would not solve everything, but it would stop the worst wind. So when neighbors later claimed the drift rose toward 20 feet in places, the snow did not become the cabin's executioner. It became part of its winter armor. Historical context helps explain why this kind of hybrid thinking emerged among certain people and places. In the broad history of North American settlement, building methods were always adapting. Accounts of construction traditions in New France described how builders used available materials, earth, stone, wood, and how they experimented with insulation by thickness and changing wall forms to match climate and resources. And log building scholarship emphasized how various immigrant groups brought their own approaches: Scandinavian tight-fitting joinery that reduced the need for chinking, German and Swiss traditions that influenced plans, and French colonial uses of vertical logs and timber frames in other regions. Étienne's method sat at a crossroads of those ideas: a log shell familiar to the West, an earthen infill logic rooted in French-derived tradition, and a thermal mass approach aligned with the practical reality of wood scarcity. But none of it mattered until the true test arrived. As autumn gave way to winter, the valley's laughter thinned and the sky grew heavy. Men stopped visiting each other for sport and began visiting for necessity. The last wagons creaked under loads of hay. The last deer were smoked and hung. The last cords of wood were stacked close enough that a man could reach them in a storm. And then, in January of 1875, winter came down like a verdict. The first great storm of that season arrived after the new year, when the cold had already hardened the ground into iron. The day began with a strange quiet, the kind that makes even animals uneasy, and then the wind rose from the high country like a door flung open. By afternoon, the air was full of moving white. Snow didn't fall gently, it drove sideways, hissing against timber, finding every weakness. The world shrank to a narrow circle of visibility. Fence posts vanished. Trails disappeared. The river sound changed, muffled under forming ice. That night, the temperature plunged. In the valley floor, where cold pooled like water, the reading fell to -15 degrees Fahrenheit before midnight. In the low hollows near the timber, it sank nearer -22 degrees Fahrenheit by dawn. In the conventional cabins, the storm was not just weather, it was invasion. Wind pushed through failing chinking. Snow sifted in fine lines along wall seams. A family could wake to find a drift formed inside where floor cracks met the wall. The logs themselves felt like frozen blocks. Men fed their stoves until the iron grew harsh and bright, then fed them again. The air became dry near the fire and bitter cold by the door. Children slept in their day clothes. Women kept kettles close so water wouldn't freeze solid. Carl Weiss, in his own cabin, pressed his back against a log wall and felt cold seep through coat and shirt as if the timber were drawing heat straight from his spine. He measured the room with a small hanging thermometer and watched it struggle to reach 34 degrees Fahrenheit even with the stove roaring. By morning he had burned through wood he meant to save. His family was not weak, they were simply losing heat faster than they could replace it. Outside, snow piled in drifts shaped by wind. Against cabin walls it banked and hardened. Paths vanished. A shed roof collapsed under weight. A man dug for his door and struck the latch with his shovel, as if excavating a buried relic. In the low spot near Étienne Beaulieu's place, the spot neighbors had warned him about snow did exactly what they feared. It piled. It was packed. It climbed. By the third day after the storm began, the drift on the lee side of Étienne's cabin rose like a white cliff. Wind sculpted it into a hard ramp. When the storm finally eased, the cabin sat half buried in a world that looked newly made. Men later swore that in the deepest cut, where the drift folded against the timber, the snow rose toward 20 feet, not as a level blanket, but as a piled mass, a wind-built wall. But Étienne's cabin did not look like it was losing a fight. It looked like it had been built for exactly this. The neighbors noticed the smoke first. Not the frantic heavy smoke of a stove being overfed, but a steady plume rising straight in the cold air, thin, consistent, controlled. Carl Weiss saw it and frowned. Smoke meant someone was burning wood, but steady smoke meant something else. A person wasn't fighting moment to moment. A person was managing. Carl and Olaf Johansson made their way through the drifts, pushing snow aside, stepping where they could, sometimes climbing, sometimes dropping knee-deep into hidden hollows. When they reached Étienne's place, they found a passageway kept open, packed down and roofed over with poles and canvas, like a temporary tunnel where drifting snow couldn't choke the entrance. Carl knocked once and pushed. The door opened. Warmth rolled out. Not a blast of furnace heat, not an oven wave that made eyes water, but a deep, steady warmth that felt like stepping into shelter after standing too long in the wind. Carl's first instinct was disbelief. His second was to look for the roaring stove that must be creating it. But there was no roaring stove. There was only Étienne's central stone and clay heat, body warm to the touch, radiating quietly. Olaf stepped inside and stopped. His face changed, less surprise than recognition, as if an old memory had been confirmed. Carl pulled out his thermometer, held it in the center of Étienne's cabin, and waited. The needle steadied at 55 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, in the open, the world sat near -15 degrees Fahrenheit. In the colder pockets, near -22 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside, Étienne's cabin held 55 degrees Fahrenheit, a difference of 31 degrees against -15 degrees Fahrenheit, and a difference of 37 degrees against -22 degrees Fahrenheit. While neighboring cabins sat at a frigid 34 degrees Fahrenheit with stoves roaring, Étienne's cabin sat at 55 degrees Fahrenheit with heat that felt calm and even. The difference was undeniable. Carl's voice came out rough. How? Étienne didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He only gestured toward the wall. Carl stepped closer and put his palm against the interior surface. It was not cold. It was not hot like a stove. It was stable, temperate, as if the wall lived in the same climate as the room rather than being a frozen boundary that stole warmth. Olaf crouched by the heater body and held his hands near it, near stone, not flame. Slow heat, Olaf murmured. It stays. Étienne nodded. A hot fire for a short time, he said. Then the house keeps it. Descriptions of masonry heaters emphasize this defining behavior: heat stored in the masonry thermal mass, then slowly radiated into the house for 18 to 24 hours. Carl looked again, this time with a builder's eyes rather than a skeptic's. The double wall meant fewer pathways for wind. The packed earthen core meant mass and reduced air movement. The sealed interior surface reduces cracks where drafts begin. Even the drift outside, feared as a death sentence, now reduced wind exposure on the buried side. Carl asked a question that mattered on a homestead more than pride or theory. How much wood? Étienne answered with numbers, because numbers were what winter respected. Carl admitted he'd burned close to half a cord through the worst stretch, just to keep his room above freezing. Étienne told him he had used closer to a quarter cord burned in shorter, hotter firings, then allowed to rest while stored heat carried the cabin. The cabin's warmth wasn't just temperature, it was behavior. Children moved without huddling. Water didn't freeze on the table. Frost didn't creep along the walls. Breath didn't hang in clouds when someone spoke. A cabin that holds 55 degrees Fahrenheit while the outdoors sits at minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit is not luxury. It is survival with dignity. Carl Weiss stood there, and something in him softened. He had laughed because laughter was safer than admitting uncertainty. Now uncertainty has been replaced with proof. He cleared his throat. "Will you show me?" Étienne looked at him for a long moment and nodded once. "After the roads open," he said, "when the clay can be worked again." That was the emotional turn, quiet but complete. Ridicule became respect. Certainty became curiosity. And a method dismissed as foolishness became something men wanted to learn. As winter pressed on storm after storm, drift after drift, the valley's idea of shelter began to change. Not a box with roaring fire-fighting drafts, but a structure that could keep heat, the way a good cellar keeps food. What happened next would prove them all wrong, not only about mud, but about what pioneer ingenuity could accomplish when it treated winter like a problem to be solved, not merely endured. The winter after 1874 did not end quickly. It lingered in shaded draws and north slopes. Even when sunlight strengthened, drifts remained like white earthworks around cabins and barns. But something had shifted in that valley. Over multiple winters, Étienne Beaulieu's magic mud cabin became a reference point. Not a tall tale, just a proven place where walls stayed calm and the woodpile lasted longer. When spring finally loosened the ground and men could dig clay again, the first imitation was cautious. Settlers patched chinking more thoroughly. They packed joints tighter, using the old layered logic of blocking and filling described in log building practice. Then the bolder ones tried what Étienne had done from the start: double walls, wooden lattice, and a dense earthen infill reinforced with fiber. The method had deep roots in French-derived earthen construction traditions, where a clay mixture with vegetal binder could be worked and applied by hand into substantial insulating wall material. As decades passed and frontier life changed, much of this knowledge faded, not because it didn't work, but because the world moved on and convenience often replaced craft. Yet the wisdom remains, waiting in old walls and in the quiet logic of physics: keep air still, store heat in mass, and build intelligently with what the land offers. And in the end, the lesson Étienne left behind was not about mud alone. It was about refusing to accept suffering as the price of living in a hard place. It was about building with respect for winter's power, for the limits of firewood, and for the ingenuity that turns humble material into shelter. If this kind of frontier ingenuity deserves to be remembered, subscribe and stay with us for the next story the wilderness tries to erase.